懸賞金はなぜここが分かった。そんなわけあるか。嫌なこった。
Hello everyone, Skippy here, and welcome to One Piece episode 918, directed by Masahiro Hosoda and supervised by Kazuya Hisada. While the actual canon content that this episode looks to be covering is quite small, there seems to be a whole lot of filler added to it to help later content not feel as random and sudden, in order to already make Act 2 feel far more cohesive than it did in the manga when it comes to plot threads. And when our former character designer Kazuya Hisada looks to be at the top of his game this week, with his extremely angular art being complemented by further transformation under Matsuda's designs and super unique line work, this episode should successfully launch off Act 2 of Wano on a high note. So will episode 918 gear us up for what's to come in this next exciting chapter? Time to open up the curtain once more and find out. This episode covers the remainder of chapter 925 and the first 6 pages of chapter 926. And despite covering your average amount of pages, the episode is actually fairly well paced on the whole thanks to a lot of continuity filler that once again fills in the blanks that Oda left. From seeing Nami and Shinobu actually infiltrate an area, to seeing Sanji set up his noodle shop, there's quite a bit of filler this episode that helps bring a connective tissue to Act 2 already. Because instead of just randomly cutting to and from places as events are in the middle of taking place, we actually see how they all unfold and lead into what we've already seen, which may not seem like much in the grand scheme of things, but it makes for a more coherent story, and even manages to give us some small classic Straw Hat interactions which I adore, because that's the heart of One Piece for me. Even when it's just stuff like seeing Luffy learn the ropes of Udon, it just feels like a much better overall experience and a much more impactful introduction to Act 2 because of that. Hosoda's direction may feel a tad bit uninspired, which makes it so these events aren't as impactful as they could have been even with some of the new OST included, but the effort to create a more coherent story all in all is worth giving a few points to the adaptation this week. While the adaptation does have some really neat ideas in tow, Hosoda's unimaginative direction sadly seeps over to his storyboard this week. While there are a couple of cool ideas in sections of the Inu vs Doji fight and the introduction of Kamuzo and the Witching Hour Boy, the board doesn't really feel all that impressive. It just feels standard and doesn't really give you much to chew on in terms of eye candy outside of those few neat compositions. Which doesn't really mean that it's a bad board whatsoever, as things are all still neatly organized at the very least, but you're just left with a rather stock board that could have used a bit more pizzazz to really sell what the episode itself was going for. Thankfully though, our supervisor Kazuya Hisada manages to distract us from the rather sterile board with his surprisingly loose and expressive artwork that overshadows some of his weaker corrections here, along with his rather impressive work on the fight between Inu and Doji, that houses his love for snappy timing and dynamic poses, and his tendency to draw background animation. So what we're left with here is an episode that by all means should be unremarkable due to Hosoda's rather weak output in a number of areas, but when we still have the building of a more coherent version of Act 2, and the unexpectedly solid output from Hisada, I can still appreciate 918 for at least giving me something to chew on, instead of being a complete and utter bland introduction to this next section of Wano. Now, while Hosoda may have fumbled a bit with the introduction of this act, it's up to Satoshi Ito to use those few neat ideas to quickly rebound it with episode 919. 2019. The preview itself doesn't show much, so I'm going to keep my expectations fairly tempered after this week, but when Ito's quality direction and storyboarding peaks out a bit, along with some interesting art from the supervisor for this episode, who still remains unknown, I can't help but look forward to it at the very least. Anyways guys, that's it for now. I'm Skippy, and that's a very cheeky shot of Nami that you have there next week, Ito.